All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this talk on Dilling and Moser that you read for today. This is the introduction to a very large book of theirs that they put out a few years back. This is the book right here. It's essentially a 500-page collection of articles by all different authors. This is the introduction you're reading on empirical research into what changes people's minds, particularly on their subject of climate change. However, for a course, we can always externalize these and think about, well, how will these become important in your life, for your profession, for the types of groups of people that you work with, right? And that's always the big takeaway of the course. So what can we take away from Moser and Dilling? I'm just going to give you an overview. You have my annotated version of the article. We'll just touch on some of the important points that you want to remember as we challenge what are probably sort of everyday folk ideas of how people are persuaded. And the second half of the course takes us much more deeply into what actually works, what the science says, so to speak, even though technically it's social science, psychology mainly, that's investigating, well, what does actually change people's minds? Because some of our everyday theories might be a little bit bunk, might not be as useful or as practical or workable or as informative as we think they are. So here's what we can take away from the article in basic. What they're doing is setting up, as I just said, a psychologically informed, scientifically tested research on how people are persuaded. This is a lot different than many writing classes you might have had, including, things that I teach. The first half of our course, to some extent, where you're using emotion, pathos, you're using logic, logos, but you're not really sure. You're being asked to use them, and you are using them. You're not sure, are you using them in the right degree? Are you using them in the right way? Is that even the most effective thing to do? It's still worth using these things in your writing. All the other writing courses where you've worked with these or where you've used logic, there's nothing wrong with that. You're still putting together logical arguments, and logic is very, very useful in some sections of society with some people, but not in every section. And our course is trying to cover other sections that typically get overlooked in the university. That would be one way of thinking of this, right? So that's what's going on there. Theories beyond what you might normally get in a class on rhetoric. These aren't language theories where you get ethos, pathos, logos, or dystopian rhetoric or something like that, but these are psychological theories, not language theories. So interested in the mind, not just the language chosen. The first half of our course was more the language chosen, personification, metaphor, dystopian rhetoric, those type of things. We're moving beyond that and maybe even challenging that a bit now. The book chapter offers very specific frameworks on persuasion, as I said, and the chapter points out how the basic model of communication, at least for climate change, but this is true in general. That is, you have an expert that's dragged out and tells you the facts to the public. It's still the major model for persuading people, yet we know that all of these facts and all of this logic doesn't really persuade people. More facts don't work, so you have to turn to other models, right? When you think that your audience is simply ignorant, it's known as the ignorance model or the deficit model often, and it works off of this assumption. If people just knew more, if they just had more facts, they would change their mind. But not really. That actually is not true. And so the next few readings for the next few days are going to explain, well, what does work? Where do you meet people? We can think of our discourse in Wolves article that you read. We had an early introduction to this type of thinking. We found out that scientific thinking is just one approach to discussing current events, discussing an issue, but that the social and the ethical matter just as much. And so that's probably the territory that we're in as well, the social, ethical, and many other things as well in this article and in upcoming readings. So what doesn't work? Here's what the article gets at. Not more information, not more scientific information. That doesn't seem to work very well. People know enough, and they really don't need to know that much in order to change their behavior, change their beliefs. It's got to be tied into their everyday actions, into some type of risk or threat that they see as likely or very, very probable that they could experience. If it's too much in the future, if it's too dystopian, then it becomes a little bit incredible, a little bit unbelievable, and doesn't really become persuasive. But if it's a viable risk or threat, then people are willing to change their behavior. That's one of the big takeaways from today, and that you'll get in a few future readings as well. So don't ask people to imagine grand or future alternatives. That doesn't seem to work. Found that in page 6. Don't deeply involve politics if we're thinking of the public sphere, where the stakeholders, the politicians, we could say, have many other values and other stakeholders to satisfy. These could be their donors, companies, certain elements of their constituency that are highly anti-environmental or pro-business. There's a lot of people that they need to satisfy. So politics isn't always the best way to get this done. Now, media, it turns out, as we saw on the page that briefly analyzed media. Media often places or sets up a one-on-one dialogue between a believer that climate change is real, even though it could be one of the most high-level scientists in the world, researchers in the world, against a doubter, someone who might not even be a scientist, someone that was dragged out of who knows where, that has no scientific info, isn't trained in science, yet they plop them both on a TV screen and let them go at it. And it makes them seem like they're on equal footing. It takes away all of the scientific knowledge, as well as the overwhelming scientific majority, 97% or higher, that believe that climate change is real. Right, and so this one-on-one aspect of that you see on TV really doesn't represent the great abundance of information, and it undermines the majority outlook on many issues, not just in climate change. We can imagine the issue of like the Me Too movement and sexual harassment. You have somebody who believes that sexual harassment is a problem in our society, and if the media does what it typically does, you'd have somebody saying, no, it's not a problem. And that makes it leaves everything up in the air. It makes it seem like it's not a problem, like as many people doubt this movement or doubt that this is a problem as people that believe in it, right? And so this is a big problem, the way that media represents things on television. It ignores oftentimes the majority stances, makes everything seem up in the air and unsettled and uncertain, when there is lots of certainty about many of these things, whether it's scientific or whether it's people's beliefs and attitudes. All right, well, what else does not work? Potentially avoiding too simple mental models. Climate change is not just bad weather, was the example we saw here, so you have to be careful what you stick things to. People's working knowledge that they already have, sometimes you have to start from scratch and avoid certain issues and say in your rhetoric, climate change is not just bad weather. It's something much, much different. You would need to say that publicly in order to hopefully move people away from just attaching new information to the old information that turns out to be the wrong information and will not build up the idea of risk or threat or something like this. Also, likely not alarmist or dystopian apocalyptic rhetoric. Doesn't seem to work well. Earlier in the course, we talked about dystopian rhetoric creating a counter-narrative to the idea of scientific progress or economic progress. We need more of what we're doing, And so in that way, that we can see apocalyptic rhetoric as being useful in creating that counter-narrative or that counter-idea to progress. But we can see here that if we're thinking of arguing some sort of science or some sort of facts, neither presenting the facts as scientific information would, or being apocalyptic about it, doomsday-ish, dystopian, neither one of those really seem to work, and there must be something else. Here finally we get in the course probably why it doesn't work, even if fear can produce counter-narratives that might be useful at some point. The idea is useful, even if not the rhetorical framework. But we find out why it doesn't work right here. Oftentimes it leads to using fear, using apocalyptic rhetoric, denial, paralysis, apathy, actions that can create greater risks. Essentially, if people don't know how to change their behavior or see that there's too much behavior or too many behaviors to change, they simply don't do it, right? And this is a great example right here of that happening. So the idea of shaming people too seems to be attached to moral argument, but shame and guilt don't seem to work very well. Why? To make it simple, we rationalize our behavior. We've all been defensive before when somebody says, you're doing that wrong, and we feel we're doing it right and we're doing okay. We get defensive. We don't listen to everybody and take everybody's advice, right? And that's just natural. It's a psychological shield, right? And so we can see that would be happening too in the messages that we receive from some of these public groups. So for this reason, we now have a really good basis in why certain types of fear, certain types of apocalyptic rhetoric are over the top and won't work. Even if, as we learned earlier in the course, they might create a counter-narrative and might generate some ideas from communities to push back against, in this case, the idea of progress. We've got now a lot of really interesting ideas on dystopian rhetoric, and you can see that it's really a complicated issue that has its benefits, but also has its problems as a rhetorical strategy. So what does work? Frameworks that show local effects and that show human effects. We see that right here on page 6. We can take that away. If we want to have some fun for just a minute and see how two groups that we've seen in the past do this. Here's the Sierra Club on this day. So if the Sierra Club is trying to encourage us to join the group and they've got to be local and show human effects, we see a pretty major fail on their homepage today, and that I'm up in the Arctic and I see seals. I don't even see people. So that's not good. Bad Sierra Club. They don't have great rhetoric today. They're hoping we care about this national issue and about drilling. But if we look at what the article teaches us, it teaches us that this is too far away, too distant, not related to human actions. So even though this is not environmental, this is not climate change, right? It's drilling in the Arctic. But even if we go here to see what's happening in your area, I won't click on it, but it's only a calendar. It keeps popping up. The North Star chapter is only a calendar. We don't actually know what's going on. We have events that's happening, but I don't know of all the, potentially risk or fear-based things that are happening in my locality. So the Sierra Club really doesn't use one of the major strategies, showing local effects and human effects. They're really, really missing that. And so you can see they could use some work on their webpage. They're not using the research. All right, here's the other thing I'm looking for. Now, if we look at the Pro-Life Action League, I would suggest they're doing a pretty wonderful job of showing that everything is local, and of showing the human causes, even though it's maybe easier in this issue since it's not an environmental issue. But we are in sort of any town, USA. All towns have roads and grass. There's a little restaurant over here, a White Castle. And we see people outside that look just like you and me protesting, right? And so here we really could say that the Pro-Life Action League, whether they know it or not, are showing that everything is local, sort of a nondescript local locality, I guess we'll say. And human effects, well, they're showing us what to do. I don't know if they're showing the human effects, even though some of these placards might be, right? But it seems like the Pro-Life Action League is much more in tune, maybe accidentally, maybe purposely, with what we're learning in this book chapter. So there's one big thing to remember. You might use this for your first paper. Frameworks that involve the social and the ethical. We saw that can work pretty well. That's on page 9 if you want to reread that. Frameworks based less in overall word choice than in a whole schema of language. We'll talk more about that in future articles, so we'll just leave that one hanging for right now. You can revisit it if you want. We can look at the basics of how-to barriers and infrastructure barriers. That is, you have to tell people. You'll find this on page 11. You have to tell people what to do or they become overwhelmed. So how can I change my behavior? Give them simple things. And there's infrastructure barriers. They simply don't have the resources to do it. And so again, you have to have rhetoric that tells them what they can do, what they can achieve, and points them toward the proper resources. So again, just even if you use the proper emotional rhetoric, you've got to tell them what to do to take action, right? How to plan change. And so that's a big part of your explanation as well. You have to avoid information overload, as the article points out. You have to use emotions that empower them, that don't overwhelm them. If we look at the basics of emotion right here, people can feel fear and despair, a sense of being completely overwhelmed and powerless. And we already talked about guilt. So you can see that there's a lot of uses of emotion that circulate in society that simply are not useful. Right? And the last thing is know thy audience. That is changing the message to meet your audience's values, changing the message to, when they might say, their locality, their everyday sense of security, as well as, the more broader spectrum of that all humans respond more or less to the same emotional rhetoric, as we'll learn in future readings. This reading didn't detail what to do, but that will be detailed in the future. The last thing I might say here then, to round this out, the authors do a good job of pointing out that in many ways your education doesn't prepare you to do some of these things. In school, we tend to focus on logical writing. We tend to focus on very specific forms of critical thinking. We think as long as you've got a claim with appropriate evidence, that's good enough. And that is for school writing and for many institutions. If you work in business, basically what you'll do 9 to 5, so to speak, probably is very, very fact-based, logic-based, uses stats, all these type of things to predict the future. But when you move out of that realm, or even when you're working, in that realm, sometimes there are many other frameworks that you want to use to communicate your ideas to make sure that you're remembered, right? So writing a report is much, much different than doing social activist work. Yet clearly, people kind of confuse the two and we rely on logic too much. So one thing we can take away, again, the big thing for this course, is what are the things that you'll need to do after college to pull out of logos, to pull out of academic writing. College is wonderful to enhance your critical thinking, but there's many more communication strategies that will be necessary in your future.